Merci. Orders of the day.
No. Just daily routine.
Daily routine of business. Tabling of documents. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Pursuant to Standing Order 36.8a, I have the honour to table in both official languages the government's response to one petition. This return will be tabled in an electronic format, Mr. Speaker, and while I'm on my feet, I would move, seconded by the member from Lac St. Louis, that the House do now proceed to orders of the day.
Monsieur Lamoureux, appuyez.
Mr. Lamoureux moves that the House do now move to orders of the day. If a participating member in person wishes that this be adopted or on division, or seeks a deferred recorded division, I would invite them to rise and indicate it to the chair.
Kevin, stand up. Ask for a recorded vote. Okay with us.
Pardon? D. Perfect.
They've gone into a vote call, so it'll be about 30 minutes before they're back up. I'm hoping it's not the entire 30 minutes. It normally isn't. I'd let the music play, but then I'd get dinged with a copyright. Yeah, that's what I didn't like about other people's channels as well. So I dedicated this channel specifically for people that just want to hear it and not hear me. Exactly. Nobody needs to hear somebody else's misinformation. And I notice there's a lot of people on YouTube that they spread their own opinion rather than the truth, you know? the classical music I'm stuck listening to on my side is horrid. 10 minutes left on the clock, hopefully. It's not the whole time, but it looks like it's going to be. Well, unfortunately, that's 30 minutes of our lives we'll never get back.
Welcome. Make sure everybody's in their seats. You're good over there. All right. The question is as follows. Mr. Lamoureux, seconded by Mr. Scarpellegia, moves that the House do now proceed to orders of the day. La période de 10 minutes pour les députés votant par...
The 10-minute period for electronic voting has started, and the House will now proceed to the vote for members participating in person. All those in favor of the motion will please rise.
Ms. Gould.
Ms. Gould.
Monsieur Champagne.
Mr. Seaton.
Back to Mr. Sajjan.
Mr. Sajjan.
Monsieur Champagne.
Monsieur Champagne.
Miss Sachs.
Ms. Sachs.
Miss Murray.
Ms. Murray.
Mr. Casey.
Mr. Casey.
Madame Saint-Onge.
Madame Saint-Onge.
Monsieur Miller.
Monsieur Miller.
Monsieur McKinnon-Gatineau.
Monsieur McKinnon-Gatineau.
Miss O'Connell.
Ms. O'Connell.
Mr. Oliphant.
Mr. Oliphant.
Mr. Gerritsen.
Mr. Gerritsen.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Miss Sahota.
Ms. Sahota.
Madame Bendayan.
Madame Bendayan.
Monsieur Drouin.
Monsieur Drouin.
Mrs. Atwin.
Mrs. Atwin.
Mr. Sarai.
Mr. Sarai.
Mr. Kellaway.
Mr. Kellaway.
Madame Brière.
Madame Brière.
Monsieur Lightbound.
Monsieur Lightbound.
Mr. Long.
Mr. Long.
Mr. McDonald Avalon.
Mr. McDonald Avalon.
Mr. Morrissey.
Mr. Morrissey.
Mr. Pulowski.
Mr. Pulowski.
Miss Bradford.
Miss Bradford.
Madame Diab.
Madame Diab.
Miss Gainey.
Ms. Gainey.
Mr. Julian.
Mr. Julian.
Mr. Garrison.
Mr. Garrison.
Miss Blaney.
Ms. Blaney.
Miss Idlout.
Ms. Idlout.
Mr. Cannings.
Mr. Cannings.
Miss Zarillo.
Ms. Zarillo.
Miss McPherson.
Ms. McPherson.
Mr. Morris.
Mr. Morris.
All those Those opposed to the motion will please rise.
Mr. Scheer.
Mr. Scheer.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mr. Kimmich.
Monsieur Deltel.
Mr. Deltel.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Mrs. Gray.
Mrs. Gray.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Jennis.
Mr. Jennings.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Bazan.
Monsieur Berthold.
Monsieur Berthold.
Mr. Workington.
Mr. Workington.
Mr. Seaback.
Mr. Seaback.
Miss Ferrari.
Miss Ferrari.
Mr. Stewart.
Mr. Stewart.
Mr. Vist.
Mr. Vist.
Mr. Macaulay Edmonton West.
Mr. Macaulay Edmonton West.
Mr. Lawrence.
Mr. Lawrence.
Mr. Patzer.
Mr. Patson.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Law.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Mew.
Monsieur Généreux.
Monsieur Généreux.
Mr. Mazer.
Mr. Mazer.
Monsieur Gould.
Mr. Gould.
Mr. Couric.
Mr. Couric.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mr. Dreeshen.
Mr. Dreeshen.
Mr. Cram.
Mr. Cram.
Mrs. Wagenthal.
Mrs. Wagenthal.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Dalton.
Mr. Dalton.
Mr. Nader.
Mr. Nader.
Mr. Soroka.
Mr. Soroka.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. Falk Provencher.
Mr. Falk Provencher.
Mr. Malt.
Mr. Motts.
Mr. Williamson.
Mr. Williamson.
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. Dowdle.
Mr. Dowdle.
Mr. Weber.
Mr. Weber.
Mr. Vierson.
Mr. Vierson.
Monsieur Simard.
Monsieur Simard.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Monsieur Barcelou Duval.
Monsieur Barcelot Duval.
Madame Vignola.
Madame Vignola.
Monsieur Trudel.
Monsieur Trudel.
Madame Bérubé.
Madame Bérubé.
La Chambre attendra maintenant la fin de la période de...
The House will now wait for the end of the electronic voting period before resuming its proceedings.
I wish to inform the House that the electronic voting period has ended. If members were not able to vote due to technical difficulties, may I use the raise hand function, and the chair will recognize them. And I don't see any hands up there, and nobody ran into the chamber that I can see. The table will now compile the results of the vote.
Rising on a point of order, the Honourable Bloc Québécois Whip. Mr. Speaker, we are unable to recognize the photo of the member for Papineau.
C'est pas dans le système qu'on voit non plus. Okay. Didn't capture the picture. The picture didn't flow to the system. So we're just making sure. Pas de main levée.
I don't see any hands raised online.
Voilà. The table will now compile the results of the vote. Nope.
Yeas for 169, 169. Nays contre 139, 139.
I declare the motion is carried. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In relation to the consideration of Government Business Number 30, I move, seconded by the Minister of Innovation, Science and Industry, that the debate be not further adjourned. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
We'll just wait for the copy of the motion. Yep. Ms. Gould, appuyée par Mr. Champagne.
Ms. Gould, seconded by Mr. Champagne, moves that.
To consideration of Government Business Number 30, I move, seconded by, that the debate be not further adjourned. Where is it? This one there. There you go. Pursuant to Standing Order 67-1, there will be now a 30-minute question period. I invite all members who wish to ask questions to rise or use the raise hand function so the chair has some idea of the members who wish to participate in this question period. Very good. So now just pick one. There you go. I'm just trying to think who wants to go first. There you go. The honourable member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan. Then we'll go there.
Mr. Speaker, this government likes to now lately claim they've had a conversion to concern about affordability. Meanwhile, for years they've been running a horrifying economic experiment. They've massively increased spending. They've more than doubled our national debt. We know now that they're spending more on debt servicing than they're sending to the provinces on health care. Outrageous amounts of money in debt servicing costs. This is what's making life less affordable for Canadians. So fundamentally, if they claim to have had this conversion to concern about affordability, will they tell the House when will the budget be balanced?
The Honourable Minister.
I'd like to thank the member, and I hope all the Canadians who are watching at home are looking at this debate, Mr. Speaker, because Canadians would agree that there's a time to consider, there's a time to debate, but there's also time to act, Mr. Speaker. And I've been saying that to Canadians and even the Leader of the Opposition. There's only one thing he can do for Canadians, only one thing, Mr. Speaker, is to vote for C-56. Why, Mr. Speaker? And they'd be well advised to listen to Canadians. Canadians have told us two things, Mr. Speaker. What they're concerned about is around housing, and it's around affordability, Mr. Speaker. That's why we had already 20 hours of debate, Mr. Speaker. 5 days. Imagine that. Canadians at home need the help that is contained in this bill, and they're wondering. These members of Parliament have been talking about 20 days, Mr. Speaker. I think Canadians watching today want action. That's what we're going to deliver.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire. The honourable member for New Westminster Burnaby.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I've said this many times, that there are two bloc parties in the House of Commons, the Bloc Québécois and the Bloc Everything Party. And the Bloc Everything Party is the Conservative Party that has blocked dental care. They've blocked provisions for a doubling of the GST credit to put so that Canadians could put more food on the table. They've blocked every piece of legislation coming forward, except, of course, the Canada-Ukraine trade bill that they voted against on the Day of Dignity and Freedom, where Ukrainians were commemorating their democracy. That's when Conservatives, one by one, voted down the Canada-Ukraine trade bill. But aside from that, on every other piece of legislation, they've been blocking. Now, we know their history. Conservatives, under the Conservatives in the Harper regime, housing prices doubled, and they destroyed 800,000 affordable housing units. So I'd like to ask my colleague, is that why the Conservatives are blocking, yet again, legislation provoked by the NDP that would actually help Canadians?
The Honourable Minister of Innovation.
Mr. Speaker, that's music to my ear, Mr. Speaker. When I listen to that, the party blocking everything. Imagine that, Mr. Speaker. Folks are at home and they're watching that. They say, the Conservative Party of Canada voted against the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement. I'm sure people are having at home and they say, what's going on in Ottawa these days, Mr. Speaker? What kind of conservatives are we talking about to vote against a nation who's fighting for democracy on behalf of all of us, Mr. Speaker? And yes, my honourable colleague is right. He brings words of wisdom in this House, Mr. Speaker. C-56 is about helping Canadians with housing and affordability, Mr. Speaker. Will the Conservative ever vote in favour of Canadians? We're going to be watching them.
Questions and comments?
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Abitibi-Témiscamingue. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Innovation, Science and Industry Minister is rather proactive on many files and on many fronts, but in Quebec, we say that everything that drags on for too long ends up not being done well. And that's the case with the Competition Act, because they've waited too long and now there are huge monopolies among supermarkets, and now the big grocery chains are hiking prices, and they're the ones profiting. And it's the same thing with telecommunications and the same thing with big banks. Fees have risen because this government didn't act soon enough. C-27 is also taking too long. There is also the Copyright Act, which is taking too long. So can the minister commit to true debate? Because currently, I feel like on his end, nothing's moving forward. The Honourable Innovation Minister. Mr. Speaker, I have a great deal of respect for the member for Abitibi-Témiscamingue, but that's exactly what we're doing, Mr. Speaker. We held 5 days of debate, 20 days of debate, and I'm listening to the member. I care about what he has to say. He says that we need to take action. Well, that's exactly what we're trying to do, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like the Bloc Québécois to support us. Mr. Speaker, we had 120 days of consultation and 5 roundtables, 400 written briefs about the Competition Act and the changes to that in our legislation. We consulted all key stakeholders, and what we're asking this House today is to allow us to move forward, because Canadians agree with the member who asked me the question. They want us to move forward. They want us to take action. So I, of course, expect that the Bloc Québécois will vote in favour of C-56 so that we will be able to reform the Competition Act, which has not been reformed in 37 years, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Kingston and the Island.
Well, it's true, Mr. Speaker. The Conservative Party is the Bloc Everything Party, but they're not even consistent. You know, they delayed with respect to the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement, and then suddenly in the 11th hour, with about a week left, they came up with this red herring that it had something to do with a price on pollution. Meanwhile, I hear the heckling from the member from I hear the heckling from my Conservatives colleagues. Ukraine has had a price on pollution since 2011. As a matter of fact, it's the only way that they could get into the European market was to commit to that. It's nothing more than a red herring. And so I'm wondering if the minister is concerned that the delay of this bill is once again just another red herring being put out there by Conservatives.
There's a carbon leakage provision in the bill.
I'm going to...
Then why is Zelensky asking for it? Why is Ukrainian voters asking for it?
Order.
Member from Kingston.
Order. It's time. It's time. Maybe we should have a talk later, send an email to each other, we can figure this out. The Honourable Minister of Innovation.
But in the meantime of the email, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to respond to that because I know Canadians are watching and they're, I mean, my colleague is right. I know that yesterday it must have been a shock for Canadians from coast to coast to coast, seeing the Conservative voting against Ukraine, Mr. Speaker, at a time of war, the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement, really? And trying to find excuses after excuses after excuses? Mr. Speaker, now we're going to see if they're going to find another excuse to help Canadians because C-56 is simple. It helped people with housing and it helped Canadians with affordability. I'm sure Canadians are saying, will they ever do something for Canadians, Mr. Speaker? They have the opportunity of a lifetime. Just before Christmas, Mr. Speaker, give a gift to Canadians, vote for C-56, and let us move forward in this country.
That's right. Questions and comments? Question commentaire, the honourable member for Calgary Rocky Ridge.
Well, good that we can actually bring it back to the debate on the motion at hand. And this motion contains a promise that this government made in 2015. So I find it a little bit difficult to take this minister, when he waxes incredulous that members may want to debate a bill that they took 8 years kicking and screaming after the opposition leader actually tabled a private member's bill that presented exactly the thing that they promised to do in 2015. So after 8 years of not keeping their promise on that particular promise on housing, how on earth are Canadians to think that somehow it's Conservatives' fault that this legislation has not been enacted and accuse Conservatives of blocking them from doing that which they promised to do 8 years ago?
The Honourable Minister of Innovation.
Mr. Speaker, I have enormous respect for the member, but let me repeat in English what I said in French. You know how much we consulted on that, Mr. Speaker, when it came to competition? 120 days of consultation, Mr. Speaker. 5 roundtables were held across the country. 400 submissions were received in 120 stakeholder organizations, Mr. Speaker. On one end, the Conservatives say, we want more debate, we want more consultation, we want more time. On the other end, Mr. Speaker, they're trying to blame us for delaying. We're saying no. Canadians are saying no to them. They said no to them in the last election. Mr. Speaker, there's a time for consideration, there's a time for debate, but there's also a time for action. Canadians want action on housing. Can they help Canadians for once? Canadians want action on affordability, Mr. Speaker. C-56 is very simple. This is the bill for Canadians, helping Canadians. Mr. Speaker, I'm sure people watching at home will look at them and wonder, will they do the right thing for Canadians once for all?
Question et commentaire, l'honorable député de Pierre Boucher.
Questions and comments, the honourable member for Pierre Boucher, Les Patriotes Verchères. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The minister talks about competition. He says he wants to help. Well, I have a suggestion for him to improve competition. There are a bunch of small businesses in Quebec which need help. For example, there's the Canada Emergency Business Account. We asked that the repayment deadline be extended 1 year. With everything they've been through with the pandemic, they're not able to repay by the current deadline, and the government gave them an extension of 18 days. 18 days, what are they going to do in 18 days? They can't do much in 18 days. We asked the government to extend the deadline by 1 year for small businesses to repay this. And we also want C-56 fast-tracked. They refused. So is the government telling us that they are letting down all of Quebec's small businesses? The Honourable Minister, Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to hear my colleague talk about competition. We know about competition in Quebec. We protect consumers. That's a value that Quebecers hold dear. But Quebecers are watching my colleague here in the House, and they're saying to themselves, well, the Bloc Québécois is, of course, going to support this legislation, which will support competition. For example, in the food sector, C-56 would give more powers to the Competition Bureau to investigate, to be able to investigate more thoroughly. So Quebecers who are tuning in today, they're saying to themselves, the Bloc Québécois will absolutely support this legislation, because if the Bloc Québécois supports competition, then they must logically support C-56. C-56 will give Quebecers new tools, new support. So, of course, Quebecers think that the Bloc Québécois will do the right thing and vote in favor of this legislation.
Comments? The honourable member for Kitchener Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as Greens, we believe we're sent here not to play partisan games, but to focus on the priorities of our communities. And right now, we're not even debating C-56. We're not debating the programming motion to move more quickly on C-56. We're debating another motion to limit debate on the programming motion. This is dozens of times. This has happened in this Parliament alone, 29 or so, I believe. My question to the Minister is, one day he might be in opposition, and is he at all concerned with the precedent that this sets, bringing forward allocation to limit time on debate again?
The Honourable Minister of Innovation.
Mr. Speaker, I would not bet on that, Mr. Speaker, but I would say that I know the member, Mr. Speaker. He's a man of good heart. I have had a number of discussions with him, and I know he's someone who wants to do what's right for Canadians. But, Mr. Speaker, like me, and I hope all the members, when they do grocery, when they walk in their ridings on the weekend, when they talk to people in the street, there's two things that Canadians are facing today. It's the cost of housing, Mr. Speaker, and it's affordability. Those are the two things that Canadians want us to take action, not only as government, Mr. Speaker, but as parliamentarian, Mr. Speaker. This is a chance that, Christmas is approaching. Canadians are watching and they say, will Parliament finally do something to help us? They want help on affordability. They want help on housing. This bill would do that, Mr. Speaker. Imagine it would enhance the GST rental rebate on new rental housing. It would give more tools to the Competition Bureau, Mr. Speaker, to go after uncompetitive practices in this country. Mr. Speaker, if the Greens want to help Canadians, as I'm sure they want to do, I have no doubt that when the vote is going to come on C-56, that they will vote in favor and vote in favor of Canadians.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire. The Honourable Member for Avalon. Avalon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I want to give the Minister a chance again to highlight the importance of passing this bill. And the reason why I asked that is because a couple of weeks ago at church, a senior slid over behind me, tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Ken, thanks for the way you voted on the carbon tax on home heating oil." But she also told me that she was at the Sobeys grocery store that week picking up a few items. When she got to the line-up for the checkout, she said, "I added up in my head what these items were going to cost me." She said, "I had to walk away, leave them in the cart. I left the store and went home. I could not afford to buy those groceries or buy those items." Can the Minister explain how this bill will help that person be able to afford to buy groceries?
The Honourable Minister of Innovation.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank my colleague because this is the reality for many Canadians. And one thing that we have seen across, many nations, the best way to bring affordability, Mr. Speaker, and stabilize prices to competition, C-56 will do something, Mr. Speaker, that's not been done in about 37 years in our country. It's going to reform the Competition Act, Mr. Speaker, in a way which is very, very clear. One way is to give more power to the Competition Authority, for example, when they do market study. The last market study was done on grocery. Imagine, Mr. Speaker, having an authority with no subpoena power. You see none of that in other G7 countries. Now we're going to fix that. The other thing, we're going to make sure that anti-competitive mergers can be blocked, Mr. Speaker, because we have seen time and time again that we have restricted competition. And the last thing, Mr. Speaker, is that C-56 will remove restrictive covenants that you find in leases, Mr. Speaker, because we've seen in his riding, like in mine, when you have a grocer in one shopping center today, there are some restrictive clauses in the leases that would prevent an independent grocers to come and compete with them. We need to put a stop to that, Mr. Speaker. And Canadians who are watching at home are saying, they trust on us to do the right thing for them. The only reason we're here, Mr. Speaker, is to serve the people at home. They sent us to do something. We're committed to do that.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire. The Honourable Member for Cypress Hills Grasslands.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We already heard earlier that there are elements in this bill that belong to Conservative private member bills. The Fall Economic Update yesterday also has taken 4 more Conservative private member bills, including portions of my own. I'm just wondering, how many more Conservative ideas is this government going to have to steal to try to help Canadians, or when will they call an election so that we can actually take Conservative ideas and implement them as a Conservative government instead?
The Honourable Minister of Innovation.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm glad to take the question from the member because you know what? Parliament, like we said, this is the place where we should debate ideas. I mean, this is the place where the best ideas should come from and actually, Mr. Speaker, that we implement. That's what we're saying with C-56 and the motion you have. There's a time for consideration, there's a time for debate, but there's also a time for voting and acting, Mr. Speaker. So the member, if he believes in what he said, he should be all in favor and running his caucus to say, hey, listen, Christmas is approaching. Canadians are going to be watching. We need to do the right thing for Canadians. The two things that matter to Canadians, Mr. Speaker, is around housing and affordability. C-56 is going to help Canadians, so if he's true to his word, he's going to convince his colleagues to vote for C-56.
Questions et commentaires. L'honorable député Longueuil.
The honourable member for Longueuil. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can't believe it. My colleague says this is urgent today for housing, C-56, but they haven't really done much about the housing crisis. In the past, they had opportunities to do things, but these measures will only kick in 2026. But we need 100,000 new units a year in Quebec now. And the way things are going, there will only be 8,000 built. There are so many homeless people in Quebec. There are deaths in Granby, Rimouski, St. Jerome. Not 1 cent has been spent today. I can't believe they're saying it's urgent when they didn't put any money into the economic statement 2 days ago. The Honourable Minister of Immigration. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank my colleague for his question. It's so urgent, Mr. Speaker, that we had to have a motion to force members to vote on this. I understand my colleague talking about emergency. I share that feeling. That's why we're forced to present a motion like the one we have this morning, because after 20 hours of debate, 5 days of debate, we need to take action. We need to get down to work. I'm listening to my colleague, and I agree with the spirit of it, but that's precisely what we're dealing with on the other side of the House. People are trying to slow things down over and over again, and they're preventing us from moving forward on behalf of Quebec and Quebecers and the whole country, Mr. Speaker. So if they want things to move forward, because I know they want things to move forward, well, then he should convince his colleagues to vote for C-56 to help Quebecers with housing and certainly help Quebecers when it comes to affordability. That's what people want from us, and that's what we're trying to do here today, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Lambton, Kent, Middlesex.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, through you, I'd like to ask my colleague, you talk the big talk. You want to help Canadians. You want to help them with affordability, yet this bill is not going to do that. Your government is taxing farmers, quadrupling the tax, through you, Mr. Chair, on farmers. The Senate is stalling Bill C-234, where we could give $1 billion of relief to our farmers to help bring down our food prices, and this government is asking to take away free enterprise from making their own business decisions. The reality is that this bill is not going to actually do anything to bring down grocery prices for Canadians. Mr. Chair, this government is living in a fantasy land if they think that the retailers aren't actually going to pass along any new taxes or any new protocols that this government puts in place onto consumers. So, Mr. Speaker, why will this government not do something concrete like axe the carbon tax and push their senators along to get Bill C-234 passed to give farmers immediate relief right now from the carbon tax?
L'honorable ministre.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank my colleague for a question. Well, Mr. Speaker, one way to help, everyone in Canada, and I'm sure she would agree, if you look at countries around the world, the best way to stabilize prices, reduce consolidation, having more competition, lower prices to competition, Mr. Speaker. Everyone would agree that this is the best way to make sure that we will help Canadians. And the bill is doing exactly that, Mr. Speaker. The last time anyone touched that bill, Mr. Speaker, was 37 years. We're presenting the most important reform of competition. Why? Because we want to give more tools in the toolbox so that we can act, Mr. Speaker. We want to help Canadians from coast to coast to coast, and they understand at home. They've seen it time and time again. The best way for us collectively as parliamentarians to do something meaningful, something concrete, is to increase competition in this country. And I'm sure my colleague would agree with that, because I know her and I know she cares about the people in her riding. She cares about Canadians, and they're watching today. And I'm sure they say she will do the right thing. She will convince the Conservative caucus and say, yes, we're going to do something for Canada. Yes, we're going to do something for consumers. Yes, we're going to do something for competition. We're going to be watching.
A little less than 9 minutes remaining. Questions and comments. The honourable member for Nunavut.
This is such an important bill, especially for Nunavut, given housing and the price of groceries are so high and so difficult. in Nunavut. So I would love to have seen more conversations about how we could make improvements, and I think this bill would do just that. It's unfortunate that we're discussing closure, and I think if I understand it correctly, maybe you can help me to understand this better, but this is because there's been a lot of filibustering going on in this House, not just during this debates in the House of Commons, but also debates in committees. I had the unfortunate experience of replacing a colleague of mine at one of the committees yesterday, and all I sat through was conservative filibustering. And I wonder if the minister can explain the cost of filibustering and why we needed to do this.
The Honourable Minister of Innovation.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank my colleague for a very thoughtful question. I think she pointed out what's going on in this place, and I hope Canadians are watching, is that what we have in front of us is a party which will do anything to block any progress, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday we saw something egregious. We saw them blocking the Canada-U Free Trade Agreement, Mr. Speaker. And what she's saying is that you see that time and time again. This is a bill, Mr. Speaker. Honestly, if I look in my own heart, I would think that we should have unanimous consent, Mr. Speaker. This is a bill to improve housing and affordability. You would think that anyone who's been sent here, they've been sent by families. They've been sent by members of their community. And I know that these people expect us to do the right thing. When it's about helping them, Mr. Speaker, like she said, she would not expect people at home to say, I sent someone there to block, to filibuster. They've sent people here on all sides of the aisle to make sure that we work for Canadians. Mr. Speaker, this bill is about more housing. This bill is about more competition. This bill is about Canadians, Mr. Speaker, and I hope that everyone in this House will vote in favor of C-56. Let's give a gift to Canadians at a time that they need it most.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. L'honorable député de Pierre Boucher.
The honourable member for Pierre Boucher, Les Patriotes. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The minister talks about competition, and I'm glad he does, because there is a problem with competition currently. People are paying more than ever before for groceries. And the minister recently in the House, after speaking to the heads of the grocery chains, said that he'd looked at the flyers and there were some good deals, so the problem was solved. But the fact is, not long after, grocery stores were racking up even bigger profits, and they said, well, people have found a solution to inflation. They changed their buying habits. For example, instead of buying fresh vegetables, they're buying frozen, and so on. So there's no problem. People simply changed their purchasing habits. That's what the CEOs of the grocery chains said. And the minister said the problem was solved just from looking at flyers. Can we fix this problem? I think there's something that's really not working here. Is that really, does the minister really think he's solved the problem of inflation? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, I agree with my colleague that we need to do more. The meeting with grocery store chains was a first step to help Canadians. We told them that's what we needed to do, but we're not fooled. We know that we need to do more, and that's why the bill, and I know my colleague will support this bill, I can see it in his eye, because C-56 is going to give the Competition Bureau more powers to investigate, for example, the major grocery chains. So what he's saying is true. And I know he says what he means, and I know he'll vote for C-56 because C-56 will give the Competition Bureau more power to get to the bottom of things, and we know that the best way to help consumers is through more competition. So Quebecers will watch him when he votes on C-56, and I'm sure he's going to vote in the right way.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire. The honourable member for Yorkton Melville.
Much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's been 8 years of this government failing Canadians over and over again, and the reason that we're in the circumstances in this country that we are today is because of the economic decisions of this government, along with increased taxes at a time when Canadians are earning less and the cost of everything is more. The question they are not answering that Canadians are asking that is more important to them even than this is why they choose not to take responsibility for the fact that Canadians are in the emergency, urgent scenarios that they're in today because of decisions made by this government. So my question is, when will this government do what this party has said from the very beginning? Our leader recognized this was going to be an issue a long time ago, refused to respond to it in any way. So when will this government do the things that will make the long-term, fast responses that this country needs? Remove that carbon tax so that Canadians can afford to live and inflation will go down. Those are the things that Canadians need from this government.
The Honourable Minister of Innovation.
Mr. Speaker, I would not have talked about the leader of the Conservative, but since my colleague is raising the leader, I mean, let's remember, Mr. Speaker, for those watching at home, this is the leader which advised Canadians to invest in cryptocurrency, Mr. Speaker. So in terms of economic advice, I'm sure that Canadians would probably agree with me. Let's not follow anything that he says, Mr. Speaker. But when she talks about a record, Mr. Speaker, I'm so happy because she will have seen, because I know her, she looks at stats. The OCDE ranked Canada third, Mr. Speaker, in foreign investments that have come in this country. Just after the United States and Brazil, third is Canada, Mr. Speaker. This is like a record, you know. We're attracting investments like we've never seen before. You can think about Volkswagen, you can think about Stellantis, you can think about GM, you can think about Ford, you can think about Volta, Mr. Speaker. The world is realizing that Canada has what it needs for the economy of the 21st century. A decarbonized economy, an economy which deals, which you know, bets on the talent of people, which bets on renewable energy, open markets, Mr. Speaker. I know that she's looking at that and she say, wow, what a record. And I wish that the Conservative would join us to make sure that Canada is the place that everyone looks around the world to invest.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire. The Honourable Member for Winnipeg North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the leader of the Conservative Party has courted members of the membership of the People's Party, we have seen the far right actually take over the Conservative Party. And to amplify that fact, one only needs to take a look in terms of how it is the Conservatives collectively voted against Ukraine just the other day in the trade agreement. But my question is that reckless behavior that we're witnessing on a daily basis coming from the Conservative Party, Mr. Speaker, is demonstrated on the floor as the Conservative Party is determined to filibuster and do whatever it can to prevent legislation from passing. I'm wondering if my colleague can provide his thoughts in terms of how the far right has really reached into the House of Commons through the Conservative Party of Canada today.
He actually has enough class, he probably won't.
The Honourable Minister of Innovation.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank my colleague for his question. It would take me more than an hour to try to explain that to Canadians, but I don't think I could find any answers. What Canadians witnessed yesterday, and I'm sure they're still at home and wondering, did really what they saw happen, that the Conservative Party of Canada in 2023 would vote against the Canada-U-Trade Free Trade Agreement? Really, Mr. Speaker? At a time where a nation is fighting for democracy, at a time that that nation is fighting a war, Mr. Speaker, this is a time where you need to help. But I know that, you know, Mr. Speaker, there is still maybe there is a glimmer of hope, Mr. Speaker, because Christmas is approaching. I know my colleagues are eager to go home, but Canadians are asking them to do one thing. Please vote for C-56. Give something to Canadians before you go on vacation, and make sure we have more affordable housing and more affordability across this country, Mr. Speaker.
It's my duty to interrupt the proceedings at this point and put forthwith the question on the motion now before the House.
In relation to the consideration of government business number 30, the debate not be further adjourned. If a member participating in person wishes that the motion be carried or carried on division, or if a member of a recognized party participating in person wishes to request a recorded division, I'd invite them to rise and indicate it to the chair. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, would request the recorded vote, please.
Call in the members.